Hi everyone, I'm Eshna Gogia, Program Manager at Republic of Work, and I'm beyond delighted to be joined by a very special guest today, Sean O'Sullivan, Managing General Partner at SOSV. Sean laid the foundation for SOSV as a super angel investor in 1995. In 2007, based off the success of the investments that had done remarkably well, Sean began expanding SOSV, transitioning it from a personal investment vehicle into an organization which today has more than 130 staff, supporting investments in over 125 startups every year. So without further ado, let's jump straight in and chat about all things deep tech. Right, so we'll get started. Really excited.
A great pleasure to meet you, Eshna.
Likewise, Sean. Thank you so much for joining us today. Um, SOSV's portfolio spans diverse sectors: synthetic biology, there's industrial biotech, there's hardware tech, therapeutics, healthcare, and more. It's a wide spectrum of converging technologies working towards human and planet health. So we'll start at the beginning. What was the inspiration behind founding SOSV, and what drove you to focus on deep tech and build out programs like IndieBio and Hacks?
Well, SOSV was founded in multiple stages. Really, initially, it was just me and a checkbook, investing, in startups that I came across and founders that I respected, doing things that I thought were worthwhile. So in that phase, I think startups in general are the way to make change happen in the world. If you're unsatisfied with the status quo, startups is the way to improve the status quo. In terms of the deep tech approach and our way of actually creating those opportunity sets and also making it possible for startups to go further and faster in the way that we do with our programs, we chose deep tech because effectively, there's a lot of software that's out there, a lot of e-commerce marketplace, which just seems to be about spinning your wheels, not really advancing humanity or really making much of a difference other than simply to create a company and to create revenue and to create clicks and activities and to get financing. So I think there's a bit of startup theater in a way where you are going after just metrics that make you feel like you're building, a business, which is great and absolutely essential, but actually not making the change in the world that you want to see. There's an expression from Gandhi. It says, be the change you want to see in the world, right? So if we're thinking that we need to have another social media network or another fintech application that is going to sort of charge a little bit more money to the consumers in order to be able to make or break it up into multiple payments or something like that in order to get consumers to buy more or whatever. Yeah, there's a business there, but is it really actually improving people's lives? Is it really, moving the needle for making humanity a better experience, just living in this humanity? So when we go after deep tech, we're going after some of the most fundamental problems of human health and planetary health that are facing the world today. And that's why we go into the areas that we are in climate, in medical devices, in robotics, and in the things which are actually providing huge efficiency advantages, which often have climate advantages.
Absolutely, that's true. But when we actually look at deep tech innovation, the development cycles are often quite long, and there are, of course, higher risks involved as well. The startups typically have a very different characteristic. Their risk profiles are absolutely different from when we look at traditional startups. When you talk about scientific breakthroughs or the potential that they hold to change the world and solve some of the pressing, issues that we have before us, how do you balance these against, the potential for finding something that's going to be a significant breakthrough?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple of things there. One is that it's actually not as risky as you think to tackle more difficult problems. if you're going to build a software business that's going to succeed, you're going to spend 10 years building it anyway, to any scale that matters and to any value that matters. So, it may take 7 years instead of 10. It may take 8 years instead of 10 or 12. There are certain deep tech problems which are longer period problems, and I totally acknowledge that. In particular, pharmaceuticals with the regulatory aspects of that, and so therefore, if you're looking at 4 or 5 years before you even get to the clinic, or you get to first in human trials and things like that, I understand that's a long way away from the customer, and there's a lot of risk in that area and a lot of expense. And so we do that kind of investment, but it is actually just a small fraction of what we do. It's about I'd say about 7%, 5 to 7% of our investments are in the pharmaceutical sort of area and highly regulated areas like that. But in general, deep tech, people don't realize how often software companies don't get funded. I think every software entrepreneur realizes that, but in fact, deep tech gets funded just as much as software does. There's many fewer deep tech companies, but the ratio of companies getting funded is actually higher, we find, and especially in terms of repeated funding over time. So even though the odds seem really long to make a change in the world that is going to actually change how people operate day to day in the future, or change whole industries, rather than like a software app for messaging or something like that, those are like, it's kind of worth the risk when you think about it. What's worth it to get up every morning and to motivate not just your have your staff and your team be highly motivated, but also your shareholders and the customers be highly motivated. It's for tackling big problems, world-changing problems that all of us are facing.
100%. And what differences would you typically see when it actually comes to investing in deep tech versus regular tech? What would be those significant differences that you'd see in the landscape?
I'd say there's more similarities than there are differences. You need great founding teams. You can't just do this alone. You need a well-rounded team. You need people who are focused on customer problems. I'd say, in terms of the qualifications for certain types of deep tech, we do see a lot more later stage founders going into the deep tech area. Maybe they've been out, had to spin in industry for 10 years or got their doctorate or working in a postdoctorate environment. Yeah, about 40 to 50% of our founders have a PhD, which is much higher than when I started my first company, I didn't have a PhD. I still don't. I will never. I think I could say at this stage, I'm going to turn 60 next year. I don't think I'm ever going to get a PhD, although I'd love to get one. I think we're backing companies from all levels of education, but there's certainly a higher higher research component, and spending more years doing fundamental research and fundamental discovery in many of the teams that we back. Which is not to say that everybody on those teams needs to have a PhD or anything, certainly not. And some teams don't have any they're just the school of hard knocks kind of people that came up with their own innovations perhaps even before graduating from college. So we have a wide range of founders, but in general, I'd say the educational profile is much more intense, and they're probably a bit older in terms of the deep tech founders.
One of the other differences we also see in deep tech is the fact that there's no blueprint for investing in deep tech companies or in investing in scientific based companies as well. What are your thoughts around it? Do you think we'd be able to come to a point where we can actually say this is what success looks like for deep tech?
I think success looks like the same as it does for most startups, which is to have customers being happy with the products you're creating and to have some traction and some continuous growth in your business. Those growth for deep tech companies, I'd say, that growth may come through hitting technical milestones rather than sometimes just hitting another $5,000 or $10,000 a month in revenue. But when, and sometimes it's in funding milestones, getting the right people to believe that what you're doing is fundamental enough that they can advance you the 10 million bucks or whatever it may take to upscale your bioreactors to like a really, good size plant, and so there are different milestones that you'd hit for sure.
Quite interesting, in one of your interviews recently, you had mentioned that everyone thinks venture capitalists are willing to take risks, but they really don't want to take any risks. They want to invest in sure things. But when we look at SOSV, SOSV does stand out in this regard because it is known for identifying emerging tech, whether it's cultivated meat or growing, leather out of mycelium. It is invested in companies where it was hard to quantify or validate traction. One of my other questions would be, how do you evaluate startups across diverse sectors that you've been investing in? And what does SOSV look for in companies when it comes to early stages, whether they come
Yeah.
from labs or DIY garages or co-working spaces?
Well, I mean, I think, you don't eat the elephant all in one bite here. So like what we do is we start, the idea is you have to cut it up into pieces and whatnot. I actually don't eat meat, so this is a bad example. But there's the idea you can cut off the trunk, you can cut off the legs or the arms, and there's whatever. You have to actually break it up into sections like you would a cow or whatever, or sheep or whatever. And like for the same thing is true for deep tech investments. Like what we do, is instead of trying to say, hey, this is a great idea to, replace meat with, bioreactor grown meat rather than animal grown meat, we'll take a punt, really, and we take a risk. It's typically $500,000 our first check for our life science companies. And for us, we're willing to lose that money entirely. And so, but at that same time, we're also de-risking the company hugely by proving that it can do something. And maybe they make their first meatball. And I'm thinking of a company called Upside Foods now that where it was the dream of this guy that, he could create a world without slaughter. We liked the idea. We had previously backed other companies that were making, like milk without cows, et cetera, but actually growing the meat and growing it in a scalable way and seeing how you could make it available to consumers at a cheap enough price that it would be competitive. That was many steps down the road. So we took the first risk, and said, okay, we'll put in $250,000 into this to do the experiment, really. And we bought a tiny portion of the company, like going through the program. We only end up owning 10 to 15% of the company. And they then de-risked it. They were able to actually create a product that was only the size of one meatball. It cost about $80,000 per pound for the meat. It's more than you'd pay in the grocery store, and so it wasn't really proving it all out, but it certainly proved something. And then from there, they were able to get some national attention and actually eventually hundreds of millions in financing. But they proved it stage by stage. You don't eat the elephant all in one bite. They proved it step by step. They were able to get it down to $8,000 a pound, $800 a pound, $80 a pound, $16 a pound now. And so, it actually is approaching, what it costs to grow the meat using animals. And so like these are examples of how we we invest in deep tech. You start out with, something that seems impossible, and you try to figure out a way to make it inevitable.
What kind of supports would startups typically receive during these early programs? Because they're way early, they probably have a proof of concept or something on a pilot scale in their lab. How does SOSV's investing model differ and help the startups grow across, these different phases, from starting off in the lab to maybe making a pilot, a pilot product, to sort of, partnering with different distributors and so on?
Yeah, well, like the first thing that for many founders is, the first thing to do if you're a lab-based company, if you're actually trying to do these very, very hard to do products, whether it's robotics or some sort of mechanical devices or medical devices, or a lab-based process like creating bioreactors and all of that, is it actually costs you a couple $1 million just to build your lab, right? So we take that out of the equation by having spent tens of millions of dollars around the world building out these different lab facilities, and people can just come in, use those labs, and basically take out the CapEx from their original funding rounds. So we make it possible. We give them the money that they need to do their experiments and whatnot, and we give them the resources, in that we have lab managers and PhDs and molecular biology and PhDs in chemistry and whatnot, that can help support them, and real practical engineering staff as well on our staff. We have about, of our 100 plus talent around the world, we have 70% of it works in our programs as directly working with the startups at that pre-seed stage where we start investing. And so we provide them with some technical expertise so that they can get to the real heart of the problem, rather than having to do what everyone does is spend all their time and spend the first 2 years raising the money so they can build their lab, then build their lab, and then get on to finally actually doing their experiments and validating it to the point where other investors feel comfortable coming in. So for us, the things that we're doing to de-risk the companies is to provide them those essential first steps. And I think that makes those next steps possible. You asked about those next steps being, interfacing with customers and all of that. That also is one of our core requirements, is you can't just have a founder coming into our programs. You actually have to have a team of founders. That team could just be 2 people, perhaps. It could be 4, it could be 5, 6, whatever. We have teams as large as 10 that come into our programs. And if you have 2 or 3 founders, you actually can break the job out into 2 or 3 types of attacking 2 or 3 areas and de-risking 2 or 3 areas. One of them, of course, is customer acceptance, validation, letters of intent, things like that can prove that there is a demand for what you're doing. Fundraising is also often broken out into the non. Sometimes it's the technical people that are actually doing the lab that are also the best fundraisers, but a lot of times all the customer engagement, business development work is being done by another part of the team. So you can have 2 or 3 engineers on the team, 1 engineer that's more focused, or scientist that's more focused on customers, and the others that are more focused on the central innovation. But we help the teams by connecting them with, we have thousands of mentors in our communities. I wouldn't say it is over 1,000. It's not probably thousands. It's probably between 1,000 and 2,000 of industry connections that we make for folks, and those help them get to revenue more quickly, pilots and things like that can validate the customer interest is there, so that the next VC is willing to fund. One of the things that people look at us and they say, hey, geez, you guys got $1.5 billion under management. That's a lot of money. Is all that money going to come into our company when we invest in you? And the truth is, no. What we do is we are the first check in Deeptech, and we are the supply chain for the rest of the Deeptech venture capital industry. And we also we de-risk the waters so that other VCs that would be generalist VCs or even software-focused VCs can come in and make credible and good investments in these deep tech areas, because we de-risk it. Not only do the companies that come into our programs, 8,000 people apply. We fund only between 100 and 125 a year. And so it's a pretty hard thing to get into one of the programs. But then on top of that, we also, if they get into the program, but their science doesn't work, or they're sort of faking the science, or the team is sort of fakers in any way, we have to flush the team. So that's another risk of being the first check, is saying, ooh, we can't bring this on to the rest of the industry. We have to actually say, thank you, but it didn't work, and it's usually, if it's a fundamental science thing that didn't work, we just have to let any investor know that we don't graduate the teams if it's not working, because if it did, it would ruin our reputation. We have to be the safe next step for investors. So that's a piece of it as well, is that we want them the startups to succeed, and most of the times they do. Right. So it's only one time out of 20 or something where you have a chancer who's trying to say that the thing is working, but actually you look at the data and you're just like, oh no, that's not actually working. Or you're working with the founder and they're misrepresenting. That happens, so we can't take the reputational risk of putting it on. But all this is to say that we invest about $100 million a year into the startups, but it's the follow-on investors that we help introduce the teams to, that invest $2 billion to $2.5 billion every year into the companies that are coming through our programs. So we get a lot of leverage from the next round of investors. Normally, it's we give the greatest support in the beginning at the pre-seed level, seed level, Series A level, with most of the capital at the seed and Series A coming from others, and then at the Series B and later stages, they'll be giving 20 times as much capital as we're able to give. We focus on the pre-seed stages.
That actually
and seed stages.
Yeah, that actually brings me to quite an interesting point, because having looked at your portfolio and having followed SOSV for a long time now, raising successfully, of course, is a big part of the startup journey, as well as building products. Building to deliver products is another important aspect. How do your portfolio companies manage this? Because when we talk about Perfect Day or MycoWorks, they raised pretty much within the next year, within the time when they were doing their showcasing on the demo day. They did have offers. They were in the final talks with their investors as well. Considering the pressures of raising fund while simultaneously developing their products, how do your companies manage that?
I think every startup knows that this is an extraordinarily hard thing to do. I think the easiest way of getting investor interest to be able to raise funding is to have some kind of traction. And a lot of times in the deep tech companies, it's this just amazing technical traction, which is enough. As you've noted, we don't go for the tried and true. We're going for brand new moonshots a lot of the time. And and when I say, everyone thinks venture capitalists are willing to take risks, they don't really want to take risks. We do know that we are different that way, but everybody is also trying to just maximize the the safety. And so what we're trying to do is, by the time they get through our programs, is we're trying to de-risk them enough so that the startups look safe to the next very risky adjusted next stage. Seed investors are still taking risks. Series A investors like to see a couple million in revenue and repeatable customers and things like that. Series B, is all about repeatable customers generally. But so the difficulty, as you say, of multitasking and being able to create those milestones and hit those traction points at the same time you're fundraising. It's super hard because you are dividing your time and energy, and that's why you always need a team. You cannot do this as a one-person effort, or you're gonna fail. I say that recognizing that it sometimes looks like it's a one-person effort. Bill Gates and Microsoft, he had Paul Allen, and he had a senior management team. What's that guy, the big sort of chunky guy that gets up on stage and goes, I forget what his name was, but anyway, so he had those people that were part of that team, that senior management team, building that senior management team out. You don't have to worry about that as a founder, because it's going to take you a couple of years to get to enough revenue to build that. But you do have to worry about having that team from the get-go, and that's that co-founding team. And generally, whether it's Sergey Brin and his partner, oh my God, I'm totally spacing. Anyway, the other Google guy, and Larry Page, thank you. These are, it generally takes a team to do it. It really does. So there's a singular vision. Perhaps there's a famous person on the team that and you talk about the Elon Musks of the world, but there's the other five guys that, and women, and particularly women in these areas of life sciences, where we have a tremendous amount. Half the teams have women co-founders, or as the CEO or the leader of the science on these teams. So I would say that you just have to have a team, and people work on they drive their lane hard, and then somebody integrates the work that's being done to make it all orchestrated and capture the traction at the same time that they're capturing the dollars. Because it's only when you have traction of some kind, technical or customer delivery or letters of intent or something, that you're going to get that funding. And that's the de-risking that I'm talking about. Venture capitalists only want to invest when it seems like there's no risk at all.
100%. And talking about challenges, challenges are anyway an integral part of any startup's journey. What sort of challenges have you observed when it comes to translating research into products, and what does that timeline look? Notco has been in the market for a while, as well as MycoWorks. What was the timeline for these companies to build a product that they could sell? And I think MycoWorks is also launching a mycelium plant soon. So,
yeah, well, MycoWorks has launched their mycelium plant, and they have engaged with many very famous customers for products ranging from the automotive industry to the so they create leather without cows, to like the Hermes, the fashion brand purses and things like that, and textile. So we've got some great companies and that are deeply engaged in the market, sometimes with hundreds of millions in revenues, after really only. I mean, the great thing about deep tech is it can really scale very quickly once you have taken the risk out, and the economics work really well. So it is possible, even though you're building physical products, whether it's a chemical, biochemical product or a medical device or something. These are companies that can scale revenue pretty quickly once they hit their traction points. So We have a couple of companies that are many hundreds of millions in revenues. I can't disclose which ones, but you mentioned one of them just a moment ago. So like, and so these companies can do that pretty quickly, and then when they do, they're also hitting unicorn status typically as well, even with just 100 million or sometimes less than 100 million in revenues. You'll hit a unicorn status with fast enough growth.
And what were some of the challenges that they had faced initially, or even, bringing the product to market? What were some of those challenges for
Well,
them?
like if you, every company has different challenges, right? So in some cases, with a therapeutic, you have to do the human trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. You have to do with a products like making meat without cows. They had to get a US FDA clearance, USDA clearance. That's a company, Upside Foods, that was the first in the world to get US FDA clearance, and the day that they got the USDA clearance, they were in a restaurant the next day, in restaurants in California with their product. So these are the regulatory hurdles, but a lot of times the regulatory barriers are not quite. I mean, it does take a lot of time and a lot of money to get through those regulatory barriers. There's no question about it. But the regulators often want to see these advances being made because they know what the problems are in the existing industry, and they know the challenges that we're facing as a society just as well as we do. So even though it seems impossible to say, wow, is the US actually going to allow meat to be grown without animals? The truth is, like, it's safer than actually growing meat with animals, and it is more obviously better for the environment, by 30 times, and better for our water supplies, better for the runoff, better for the overall food availability. There's food scarcity in the world, in various places, and this is really helping solve big problems for the world. So you will see that even though there are people that have entrenched interests that are trying to sort of shout you down or say, oh no, that's not meat or whatever, if it is meat, because it is the same thing, or if it is milk or whatever, it's just made in a different way, using nature, using the natural processes, the exact same food you would otherwise consume, for example, then there's really nothing that is unsafe about it. So let's just get on with it and solve the problems that the planet is facing.
Talking about solving the planet problems, could you tell us about some of the SOSV portfolio companies that have been able to like we've already spoken about some of the companies now, but how much impact have they had on human and planetary health as well in the last couple of years since their inception?
Yeah, well, actually, I would say almost nothing. And I say that in a way that I'm incredibly encouraged by. Like my first company, starting out of college, we invented that thing where you type an address into a computer and you see a street map, right? So it was called Map Info, grew to be a couple $100 million in revenue by the time, it went public and all of that. But it took 7 years for us to get to 1 million users. And that was a really long and hard struggle, and it didn't feel. I mean, it felt super fast, but with 1 million people using it, of like the 8 billion people on the planet today, it's a drop in the bucket. It's meaningless, right? It's nothing. So we're at that stage right now, and Perfect Day actually in the same sort of 7 years got to 1 million people using their protein products, the milk without cows, the whey proteins and the casein proteins used to make ice creams and used to make milk and other things. So so it took them 7 years, but it only took Map Info, my first company, another 12 years for the development that we had created, street maps on computers, to hit 1 billion people. So 20 years into it, 1 billion people were using it. Another 2 years after that, 2 billion people were using the technology, not just from us, from other companies as well. And then, and then now I think probably, I don't know, half the world uses it, anyone that has a cell phone or whatever. So it's to go to actually make a generational change in a technology can take a generation. These things are not instant, However, when you're on that rocket ship and going to your first 1 million users, you're like, oh my God, this is going so fast and it's so amazing. And you create a lot of value. It doesn't feel like it's slow, but it is essential to get to those first 1 million customers before you get to the 100 million customers, before you get to 1 billion customers, before you get to 5 billion customers. So and so that, when you say how much of a difference have we made yet to the planet, nothing other than hope, I would say, or nothing other than those first 1 million customers across a variety of industries. What will it make? What difference will it make? I can say that, and I'll just give an example of this sort of counterintuitive sort of food market. Food is actually about 30% of our greenhouse gases. And in this whole discussion, we're overweighting food just because people understand food. They eat it 3 times a day. I give stories around food and you ask stories around food because these are things that people can relate to. We do a lot in carbon sequestration. We do a lot in industrial innovation, manufacturing, building materials, regeneration, agriculture, et cetera. There's loads of areas that we're doing work in. But in food, in particular, it causes 30% of our greenhouse gases. So, that is actually a huge piece that needs to be addressed if we're going to decarbonize the planet. For example, you've heard of electric cars and how they're going to save the world, right? That's 2%. That's just 2% of your greenhouse gas footprint is electric cars. It's almost nothing. And yet people and governments are putting all this effort and energy, and rightfully so, into this area. And I think it's a great thing that they're doing it. But there are much bigger problems to be solved. And one of these much bigger problems to be solved is in the area of food, where you can, just by eliminating animal agriculture as a primary source of food, by substituting those animal proteins and those animal products with stuff that's made more efficiently through nature and through bioreactors, we can thus, reduce just by animal agriculture alone. If you simply stopped using animal products in your daily life, you could reduce your greenhouse footprint by 20%. So it's a big and essential difference that needs to be made. But every industry, whether it's building materials like concrete for building houses and things like that, 6 or 8% just in office buildings and things like that, roads, et cetera. All of these use cases are super important for eliminating greenhouse gases. So SOSV goes through industry by industry. We are tackling 100 different sources of carbon generation in the close to 1,000 companies in our portfolio, over 1,000 companies in our portfolio that are going after these means of production for the food, for manufacturing, for building supply, for transportation, and for energy itself.
I think the fact that we can use microscopic factories to convert any raw material into sustainable alternatives is fascinating by itself. And I do hope to see a lot more of these products in our day-to-day lives as well. But SOSV operates globally. how does that reach contribute to scaling deep tech companies or scaling and supporting startups, and as well as, identifying emerging trends and, what innovation could mean in different nations across the world?
Yeah, well, we have over 100 people globally. Over a third of our staff is in Asia. I'd say about a third of our staff is in North America, and the remaining staff is spread between the rest of the world. Europe, obviously, a large concentration, 20% or so, and the rest of the world. So we do have a global reach of where our people are, where our facilities are, where our labs are, and where the markets that our companies are reaching out to exist. That said, any company we back, needs to be whether they're coming from, Peru or Argentina or, Ireland or the United States, they need to be a world leader in what they do. So, we very much are focused on companies that may feel local to a given country, but are global in their scope and global in their reach. And I think that's a fundamental need for most of these deep tech companies, is to be the very best in the world, or else they'll be defeated by the next competitor. So we do have a global reach. It actually gives us, I think our founders are coming from, the stats are online on this, so you could probably get a better number, but I think it's 90 countries. We have, of the 90 countries that they're coming from, I think it's like 57 countries that we have operating facilities in for our companies, where they have headquarter facilities in 57 different countries. So even if you've got a company that's coming from India or going through our programs in New York or San Francisco or in Shenzhen or Tokyo, like those will end up back in India in some percentage of the cases, and have their headquarters and most of their staff and operations in India, but all with a global reach. So we will, we back companies regardless of their origin. A lot of times, though, what I will say is that companies need to raise capital internationally, and because of that, a lot of times the companies will actually be coming to the US to run through the programs, to be able to speak with investors that are international investors, and will provide international valuations in some countries. And this is why, even though the founders come from 90 different countries, there's only, say, 56 different countries where they really have good, big operations. In some of those countries, there's just no local supply of sufficient capital to take the business and make it scalable. So the founder will relocate, say, to a place where it is much easier to raise capital, like the United States, and they'll incorporate in Delaware, and they'll base themselves someplace in the US or whatever. And in those cases, well, and in many of those cases, they'll still have, a workforce back in their home country or whatever. But in other cases, they'll draw the talent to wherever the immigration policies are the most forward thinking.
Interestingly, I think that brings me to the next point about building ecosystems to support deep tech. What differences have you noticed having, the global outreach? You have offices in Asia, you have offices in the States as well as Europe. What would be typically the differences that you'd see across these ecosystems? And what do you think Irish ecosystem and European deep tech ecosystems should focus on to bring these technologies to the real world and help them scale faster?
Well, I'd say that, what the challenges, like, say, Europe would have versus some, the US, and it's not just Europe, it's also Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world, where there is not sufficient seed level funding at a high enough valuation that you can raise significant enough funding. So I mean, I do recognize that funding is crucial for, this also applies to software companies, but it, you know, what is really great about the EU is the supports that they have for research grants, and the, you know, that used to be the 2020 or, you know, 2025 horizon or whatever it is.
2020 and the EIC funding now.
Yeah. All of that stuff has been great. We have huge numbers of companies that benefit from that are based in Europe. Very good forward thinking. However, like, and generally non-dilutive capital throughout all of that. So that's really good. But the challenge is that the dilutive capital, or the equity investment, is actually you know, can be quite dilutive because the valuations are so much lower. So that lowers the odds of a company in Europe from being able to have as much success, you know, potentially, or at least have the founders or the seed investors make enough money for them to then do another company or invest in another company. So that sort of holds down the whole seed. It's kind of counterintuitive, but because of a lack of seed capital, the valuations are held down, which prevents seed investors from making money on their investments because the companies don't scale. So there's that. At the certain level, the European companies have no issue because they're competing on a global level and they're getting the valuations that international businesses that are competing on a global level get, which is the same across the world, really. So you'll have, if you get to the Series B round and you're raising $40 million, you'll be just as successful in raising that money in Europe or in Ireland as you would in San Francisco or in New York. So the challenge is getting to the, you know, whatever it is, 10 million plus in revenue that it takes to get a Series B valuation. And that is, that's the gap, and that gap in funding does present problems for, you know, certain markets and lots of markets around the world. So the cheat there is for companies to, you know, to have a presence in the US, and that's what a lot of companies do, whether they're coming from Israel or coming from Ireland. They'll set up operations in Boston or New York or something in the Valley, and then use that to you know, create, you know, the customer impact and the market reach and the revenues that then get them to a place. I mean, it's access to customers is the other piece as well, and the U.S. is still a very big market for customers. So that is and it's more of a homogenous market, so it's less difficult to penetrate than having to translate your product into 15 different languages, or you know, write the manuals or have the support pages for it, et cetera, to reach the same kind of economic market in throughout Europe, for example.
Yep. Talking about new markets, Sean, it's quite interesting because when we talk about creating new markets, it's synonymous with deep tech. What are your views on this?
Creating new markets, I mean, you know, you just have to tap into a demand that people didn't know that they needed. So, you know, and that happens all the time, you know. You know, you see something new. I mean, it's amazing, actually. Like, what was it? Chat GTP that sort of had this big big surge. It's fallen off in the last couple of months. I think it's down 20% the last 2 months in a row or something. But it's still an amazing technology. It got to 1 billion users faster than any other technology in all time. That is a phenomenal growth, and it felt like out of nowhere, like, you know, not really out of nowhere, because you've had people working on AI for 40 years, but, you know, and really aggressively working on AI for maybe 10 years or so. So, but, you know, it's a 10-year overnight success, and what we see is that often happens, right? The iPhone and whatnot, these are iconic products that help shape how we view technology and are fundamental to how we live. In smaller segments, we try to do the same thing for industry, right? So we have companies that are changing the textile industry by eliminating waste in the textile industry, by having the looms which are making these fabrics automatically catch their errors instantly, saving the fabric industry billions of dollars a year in wasted products. And that has good climate impact as well, because textiles are actually a big impact on the climate industry. All those things are kind of hidden to the rest of the world. You wouldn't know that unless you knew the companies that are doing this. But we are looking for those kinds of opportunities all the time, whether it's in sustainable airline fuel or in regenerative agriculture or in new ways to do carbon sequestration. It's the 10-year overnight success thing that you are sometimes missing, the 10 years that it took before. Like the iPhone didn't come out of nowhere; it came out of they came out of the what was the thing, iPod, and it also came out of the Palm Pilot and all those ideas. But it was remarkable in terms of how they packaged it together. So we're when you look at technology, it's often crawl, 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 fly, skipping the running and walking stages completely. So and frankly, it's those fly companies that make venture capital returns possible. Most of our, when you look at it, the venture capital industry in general, it's the rule of thumb, or the thing you hear about venture capitalists. It's the only industry where you can be right 1 time out of 10 and still be considered a genius. So most of the investments that you make are not actually going to succeed. Even us, we're in deep tech, and so we have a higher hit rate than most. Over 50% of our companies do not survive 6 years. They're out there, they struggle, they get to places, but 6 years in, half of them are dead. In software it's a little quicker than that, but so that means that most of the bets you're making are going to fail. And then there's the 3 or 4 companies out of those 10 that are going to do well enough. And then there's basically 1 company out of 10, or if you're extremely lucky, 1.5 companies out of 10 that are going to return effectively the fund. So they are the one. We have big funds. We have 600 investments in a given fund. So we have about 100 companies that return on average about 15x. So across the fund, but you get the picture is that 1 out of 10 are going to pay for the risk that people are taking and the locking up of capital that happens for the 10 years, really, or 8 years or whatever, that the funds are locked into a venture capital fund before really distributing the money back to LPs.
Yeah. Just a quick follow on that. So, of course, you've had some notable investments, and last year, some of your companies did have a follow-on round for more than 2.2 billion as well. How does SOSV participate in these rounds, and in terms of preparing these companies, what sort of involvement does the team have post, the program stage?
At SOSV, we have 70% of the team that's working with the companies right at the program level, and then the same people that are working at the program level will continue to be engaged with the startups as they do funding rounds. Which is we don't join a lot of boards. We're on maybe 100 boards total, which, considering how many companies we invest, is a small percentage. And so we keep in touch with the companies when they're raising new rounds, and certainly along the way we have events, and we have a whole founder network, and the founders help each other. We have lots of events throughout the year, et cetera. But really, we are the most deeply involved in those beginning stages where the companies are living with us in our programs, in our facilities, working alongside our staff, et cetera. And then beyond that, beyond that, we are engaged with the companies on those funding rounds. So like 40% of our capital goes into the pre-seed stage, where we're just having them in our programs. We're giving them sort of generally $250,000, $500,000 check. And then the next stage is a couple $100,000 check at the seed round, where we're not actually buying up, but we're just keeping our pro rata in those companies. And the Series A, same sort of thing. Maybe it's $1.5 million check at the Series A level. And that's where most of our investment stops. We do have a select fund, which is for some of the more higher traction companies as they're doing Series B, and we write checks up to $5 million at that level. But in general, early stage investors stick to a couple of stages of investing, and that's where we focus, is at those stages. We're still heavily involved. We have a lot of relationships where we do stay on the board, not huge on a percentage basis, but a fair amount. And that is how we manage our contribution to companies going forward.
And are there any plans for new funds to support and complement existing funds like the Select Fund or the fund that you raised in 2020?
Well, we have SOSV 4, which was the fund that ended deployment in 2022, and now we are raising for SOSV 5, which is deploying in 2023 right now and onward until 2025. So it's a $400 million fund that is actually being raised and deployed simultaneously right now. We'll have another select fund, which will probably be a bit larger, a couple $100 million, but we're not raising that at this stage.
Yes, with over 2,100 investments, SOSV's impact is undeniable globally. Sean, before we conclude today, I just want to, just ask you just 2 more questions. It would be, how do you see the deep tech landscape changing or evolving in the next few years? Because the definition of deep tech remains the same, but the trends and the emerging technologies do change every few years. What does that mean for investors, startups, and for society at large?
Well, I'd say, deep tech is being redefined, as you say, with new scientific discoveries as they come along in whatever fields, in energy and quantum and in whatever areas. For us, the big deep tech trends that we see as generational trends, 40-year trends, are in biology as a technology, and using these new means of production rather than the last century, which was basically a chemistry century based off of petrochemical industry. I mean, and you look around you and you see it everywhere. You're standing on it, with the rugs on the carpet being petrochemical derived, and the stretchy shirts that you're wearing or whatever being basically nylon and petrochemicals derived, et cetera. We actually have to move to a world of biology-based products because of the efficiencies and because of the lack of generation of carbon in biology-based products. It's carbon consumptive rather than carbon releasing to the atmosphere. So these are ways where we can actually live on the planet, continue to grow to 10 billion people. These are challenges that are, challenges over the next 100 years. So we are heavily involved in that area. We think there are exploding opportunities in that front. and we don't see the need for climate change going away anytime soon, unfortunately. So climate mitigation strategies, climate technology companies. And so I think, we are seeing governments, the US Inflation Reduction Act and the European equivalents, as well as the whole world is waking up to, the impacts of climate change. And I do think that that's going to be a major driver for a lot of this. But you know what? I think there's going to be surprises. At some point you could have superconductors, and that changes a lot of things. You'd have quantum really working for cool applications, which it's not really doing anything of great interest right now. And I think that there's going to be lots of great challenges going forward that will be answered by fundamental discoveries.
And what would be your advice to any scientific entrepreneur trying to break out of the lab today?
Well, do things that matter. We have the same amount of, we're all going to live 80 years or whatever it is, roughly. The only thing we have is time. In the time that you have, do things that matter, and don't just do, another app or whatever. It's going to be a hell of a lot of effort to get these things to succeed in the first place. To do a great little software company that actually has an exit is still going to be 7-10 years worth of effort. So why not spend those 7 or 10 years of effort, tackling the central problems facing our families, ourselves, our lives, our health, and the world's planetary health. So, I think that's a piece of advice I'd pass on. Finish what you start doing something that matters.
Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing your insights into the deep tech world, innovation, whatever is happening around us, and that we actually don't see it in our day-to-day lives as much, but we will start seeing those changes. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today.
Eshna, a great pleasure speaking with you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
All right. Bye now.